The ground shook before they heard it. Private Heinz Schreiber, 22 years old, pressed his back against a burned-out farmhouse wall somewhere east of Prokhorovka and felt the vibration travel up through his spine like a living thing. Around him, the steppe had stopped being a landscape. It had become a furnace. Somewhere to his left, a man was screaming words that weren't words anymore. Smoke the color of charcoal rolled across the horizon in a single, unbroken wall, and through it came a sound unlike any artillery he had ever trained for. A low, industrial grinding, rhythmic as a heartbeat, growing louder with every second. He had no idea what was coming. His sergeant, crouched 6 feet away, did not speak. He just stared forward into the smoke with eyes that had gone completely still. Whatever was inside that smoke, it was not stopping. July 12th, 1943, southern Russia. The village of Prokhorovka sits on a railway line cutting through open steppe land that runs flat in every direction, all the way to the horizon. On this single morning, roughly 1,500 armored vehicles would converge on this ground in what would become the largest tank engagement in human history. And somewhere inside that engagement, a machine was operating at a level of lethality that soldiers on both sides of the line would struggle to describe in letters home, not because they lacked words, but because the words didn't feel large enough. This is the story of the T-34, and before we explain what made it the most consequential tank of the Second World War, we need to understand what it felt like to be standing on the wrong side of one. Operation Citadel, the German summer offensive of 1943, was meant to straighten the Soviet salient around Kursk and restore German strategic momentum on the Eastern Front. It had been planned for months. The Wehrmacht had delayed it repeatedly, waiting for new equipment, the Panther, the Elephant, the Tiger, to arrive in sufficient numbers. Hitler believed that technological superiority would compensate for the fact that the Red Army knew they were coming. They were wrong about that in a way that would prove permanent. For the Soviet soldiers waiting inside that salient, the preceding weeks had not been idle. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, perhaps the most tactically instinctive commander of the entire war, had overseen the construction of a defensive network so deep and so dense it defied easy description. 8 separate defensive belts, hundreds of miles of trenches, thousands of anti-tank guns, minefields that stretched across whole regions of countryside, and threading through all of it, like a steel nervous system, were the T-34s, thousands of them, waiting. What they were waiting for would arrive with that grinding, rhythmic sound. The T-34 medium tank. Designation, T-34/76 in its early configuration, evolving into the T-34/85 by 1944. Designed by Mikhail Koshkin, a Soviet engineer who did not live to see what his creation would do to the war. Koshkin died of pneumonia in September 1940, his lungs damaged by a brutal demonstration run he insisted on completing in winter conditions to prove the tank's reliability to Stalin. He caught the illness driving the prototype cross-country in freezing weather and never fully recovered. He never knew he had built one of the most historically decisive weapons ever manufactured. To understand why the T-34 was feared, you have to understand what the tank world looked like before it appeared. Prior to 1940, armored doctrine in most nations rested on a rough trinity: heavily armored infantry tanks that moved slowly, fast-moving light tanks with thin protection, and medium options that compromised on everything. The assumption was that armor, speed, and firepower couldn't all be optimized simultaneously. You picked two and accepted the third as a weakness. Koshkin's team rejected this assumption. The T-34's hull was sloped. This sounds simple. It wasn't. Most German tank designers in 1940 were still building with vertical armor plates. A vertical 60mm steel plate stops a 60mm worth of penetration, but tilt that same plate at 60 degrees, as the T-34's front hull was, and the effective protection nearly doubles, because incoming shells have to travel through more material and are more likely to deflect entirely. The T-34 had 45mm of sloped armor that performed like 90mm of vertical armor. German anti-tank gunners found, to their mounting horror, that shells they expected to punch clean through were glancing off and spinning into the sky. And then there was the engine. The T-34 ran on a diesel V12, which produced less fire risk than the gasoline engines in American and German tanks. Soviet crews were dying less often from their tanks catching fire on impact. Not never. Fire was a constant companion in armored warfare, but less. Lieutenant Wilhelm Ritter was a German tank commander with the 4th Panzer Division, and his letters home from summer 1941, which survive in archival collections, describe an encounter with what he initially could not identify. His Panzer III had been trading shots with Soviet tanks all morning. Most of them had been older models, machines his crews recognized and knew how to defeat. Then something new appeared at the edge of a tree line, and his first round, fired at what he considered a comfortable kill range, bounced. He fired again. It bounced again. He ordered his driver to disengage. The psychological impact of this moment cannot be overstated. German tank crews in 1941 had been winning. They had crossed entire countries in weeks. They believed, with some reason, that they were operating the best tank force in the world. The T-34 punctured that belief with the sound of a ricochet. There is a specific terror in watching your weapon fail, in that moment of confused silence between firing and impact, when the expected result doesn't happen. That terror lived in German armored units from 1941 onward, growing louder as the production numbers for the T-34 climbed, and they climbed. In 1942, Soviet factories produced approximately 12,500 T-34s. In 1943, over 15,000. In 1944, nearly 16,000. The numbers beggar military comprehension. Here is where the story of the T-34 becomes something larger than the story of a machine. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, Soviet industrial leadership made a decision. That may be the single most consequential industrial action of the entire war. They moved their factories, whole manufacturing complexes, the Kharkov locomotive factory, the Ural tank factory, the Chelyabinsk tractor plant, were disassembled, loaded onto trains, and transported east beyond the Ural Mountains, away from the advancing German line. Workers followed their machines. Some of them worked in open fields in winter conditions, while the factory roofs were being constructed above their heads. The city of Chelyabinsk became so synonymous with tank production that workers called it Tankograd, Tank City. Women, teenagers, and men exempt from military service ran 12-hour shifts in conditions that no labor law from any peacetime nation would have permitted. The German strategic bet in 1941 was that the Soviet Union would collapse before it could recover from the initial shock of Barbarossa. That bet assumed that industrial capacity was geographically fixed. The Soviets proved it wasn't. By the time Germany had developed adequate responses to the T-34, upgrading their own guns, introducing the Panther, training crews in new tactics, the Soviets had manufactured so many T-34s that the numerical imbalance was irreversible. Back to July 12, 1943. Back to that smoke. The 5th Guards Tank Army, commanded by Lieutenant General Pavel Rotmistrov, drove straight into the German armored spearhead in what some historians have described as a desperate gamble, and others as deliberate close-quarters engagement designed to neutralize German gunnery advantages. At close range, the T-34's vulnerabilities against the Tiger diminished. At close range, everything is chaos, and chaos tends to favor the side with more tanks. The fighting at Prokhorovka lasted most of the day. When it ended, neither side had achieved a clean victory in that specific engagement. The casualty figures on both sides remained debated, but the larger context was decisive. Germany had committed its strategic reserve in a single offensive and failed to break through. It would never hold significant strategic initiative on the Eastern Front again. The T-34 was not the only reason for this, but it was the machine that made the numbers possible. Rotmistrov would later write that watching his tank formations advance through that smoke, hundreds of T-34s moving in coordination, engines loud enough to feel in your chest before they were visible, produced in him something he described as awe mixed with grief. He knew what the men inside those tanks were about to face. He had no choice but to send them forward. There is a difference between military effectiveness and the texture of fear that a weapon creates in its enemies. The Tiger was feared because of its individual power. A single Tiger could, and frequently did, destroy dozens of Allied tanks in a single engagement. The fear it created was the fear of the exceptional predator. The T-34 created a different kind of fear. It was the fear of the wave, the fear of mathematics, the fear of looking through binoculars and counting and not being able to reach a number that made you feel safe. German commanders on the Eastern Front began using the phrase Panzerschreck, tank horror, to describe the psychological condition that developed in infantry units after extended exposure to Soviet armored operations. The sound alone was destabilizing. The sound of a tank company approaching, that grinding, clanking percussion, could produce paralysis in infantrymen who had never been properly trained against armor. Captain Karl Fuchs, a German tank commander whose letters have been preserved and published, wrote in 1942 about the feeling of watching a Soviet armored formation appear on the horizon. He used the word endlos, endless. Not the tanks were powerful, not the tanks were threatening, endless. No honest account of the T-34 can pretend it was a perfect machine. It wasn't. Early models had notoriously difficult transmissions that sometimes required crews to use a hammer to shift gears. Visibility from inside the turret was poor. Soviet commanders often had to ride with their heads exposed to see properly, at obvious and lethal cost. Radio communications in early models were scarce. Many crews had to rely on flag signals. The two-man turret configuration, with the commander also serving as the loader, created a fatigue and coordination problem that the Germans, with their three-man turrets, did not share. The Panther, introduced as a direct response to the T-34, was in many respects a superior tank when it worked. It had a longer-range gun, better optics, and a three-man turret. When it worked, the Panther was mechanically fragile in a way that the T-34 was not. The T-34 could be repaired in the field by crews with basic tools. It could be dragged from mud and returned to action. It was, in the vocabulary of engineering, robust. And in a war being fought across the largest land theater in human history, robustness was more valuable than perfection. There is a question worth sitting with at the end of any story about these machines. What does it do to a person? To the person inside the tank, and to the person in the field watching it come, to live inside this scale of violence. The soldiers who operated T-34s, the young men and women who built them in the Ural factories with frostbitten hands, the German infantrymen who felt the ground shake before they saw what was causing it, they all became something their pre-war selves could not have imagined. War at this scale does not leave people intact. It produces survivors who carry the weight of what they witnessed in ways that no subsequent peace can fully resolve. The T-34 changed the Second World War. It contributed, more than almost any single piece of technology, to the defeat of National Socialist Germany on the Eastern Front. That is a historical fact. But the nature of how it did so, through mass production, through sacrifice, through the compression of human beings into industrial processes on both sides of the line, reveals something uncomfortable about the logic of modern warfare. Victory, in a total war, goes to the side that can sustain the production of devastation longer than the other. The ground at Prokhorovka was quiet by nightfall on July 12, 1943, but for decades after, farmers plowing those fields would pull up fragments of steel, shards of machinery, the remnants of that single morning when the grinding sound became so loud it drowned out everything else. The T-34 was not the most sophisticated weapon of the Second World War. It was something more durable than sophisticated. It was the sound inside the smoke that kept getting louder and never stopped coming, and that, in the end, was enough.